My father told me a story once, one I'll never forget. It wasn't just the first story he ever shared with me as a child. It was also the story of how my grandfather died. But that's not why it's seared into my memory. You hear tales sometimes on TV, whispered in public, or buried in the corners of the internet. Stories about ghosts, aliens, or things that lurk in the shadows. Most people shrug them off. They think, this isn't real. It's just a story. Someone's mistaken, crazy, or lying. But sometimes, something happens that changes everything. It connects the dots in a way you never imagined, and suddenly, the world feels much bigger and darker than you ever thought it could be. This story was like that. My father swore it was true, but I didn't believe him. Not until I started finding other stories, scattered across forums and message boards, eerily similar to the one he told me. That's when I started to believe. My father didn't call it the Rake. He'd never even heard of that name. He called it the Skinwalker, after an old Cherokee tale his own grandfather had told him. But no matter what you call it, the story remains the same. It happened one night when my father was just 13. He and my grandfather were out hunting coyotes. Back then, they lived on a dairy farm in Ohio, and coyote pelts fetched $50 apiece, a small fortune for a struggling family. They hunted often, sometimes for food, sometimes for necessity. That night, they were finishing their rounds, heading home on foot. Cars and four-wheelers were luxuries they couldn't afford. Cutting through the woods was faster, though darker and more treacherous. That's when they stumbled upon it. Blood. Everywhere. It painted the trees, soaked the grass, and pooled in the creek. At first, they thought it was a coyote attack. But coyotes don't do this. Predators kill cleanly, efficiently. They take what they need and leave little behind. This was different. 3 deer, or what was left of them, were scattered across the clearing. A head here, a leg there. Guts spilled like someone had ripped them apart just for fun. Whatever did this wasn't hunting for food. It was playing. My grandfather told my dad to go home. He thought it might be feral dogs, dangerous but manageable. But my father refused. He wasn't about to walk 2 miles through those woods alone, armed with nothing but a .22 rifle and a pocket knife. After some arguing, my grandfather relented and they started tracking the thing. The trail was easy to follow. Blood led the way, smeared and splattered like a gruesome breadcrumb trail. Whatever it was, it had either dragged its prey or bled it out over a mile. Then the sound started. The forest came alive with screams, not human, but animal. Deer, foxes, rabbits, raccoons, even birds. Everything that should have been asleep was wide awake, terrified, and fleeing. They saw it firsthand. Flocks of birds crashing into trees in their desperation to escape. Coyotes barreling toward them, not even glancing their way. Deer, squirrels, foxes, and even wild hogs all stampeding in the same direction, away from something. My father said he'd never seen fear like that before. Not in animals, and certainly not in his father. But that night he did. And it was only the beginning. We should have known. We should have put it together that maybe, just maybe, whatever we were tracking wasn't something we could kill. But we didn't turn back. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was my dad's nature. He was the kind of man who ran toward trouble, who fought when others fled. And me? I was just a kid, barely old enough to understand what fear really was. But I knew one thing. Wherever my dad went, I stayed close. The trail led us into an open field. It used to be a soy field, but out of season, it was just flat dirt under the moonlight. That's where we saw the tracks again. The animals fleeing the woods had trampled the ground, but not here. Where the deer blood stained the earth, nothing had stepped, not a single mark. The tracks were shallow, barely pressing into the soil. Whatever made them couldn't have weighed more than 100 pounds. But weight didn't mean much. I'd seen a 40-pound bobcat nearly rip a man's throat out once. Light doesn't mean harmless. We followed the trail, and it led us to an old schoolhouse perched on a hill. Half of it had been torn apart by a tornado years ago, and nobody had lived there since. Sometimes homeless people or addicts would use it as a shelter. That's what we thought at first. Maybe it was just some poor soul, high out of their mind. But we didn't think that for long. We got within 50 yards when we heard it. A noise I'll never forget. It was like two sounds layered on top of each other. A high-pitched screech and a low, guttural growl, rising and falling together. At 20 yards, it got worse. The sound shifted, like paper tearing and water sloshing in a bucket swung back and forth. My dad knelt down, motioning for me to stay behind him. He whispered that we were about to corner it. "Any animal will fight when it's cornered," he said. "Especially a predator." The plan was simple. Sneak up, shoot it while it was eating, and keep shooting until it stopped moving. If it got to him, it was my job to shoot or stab it to get it off. I nodded, gripping my .22 rifle so tight my hands shook. We crept closer. I stayed just behind my dad, peering around his shoulder. And that's when I saw it. It was hunched over a carcass, tearing into it with an unnatural ferocity. Flesh and blood splattered the bricks of the schoolhouse, glistening under the moonlight. The thing was pale white, its skin stretched tight over a gaunt, human-like frame. But it wasn't human. Its arms and legs were too long, its joints bent wrong. It crouched like a monkey, its long fingers ending in claws that dug into the meat. My dad froze. He wasn't about to shoot a person, no matter how monstrous they looked. So he cleared his throat, trying to get its attention. And that's when everything stopped. The forest went silent. Not the kind of quiet where you can still hear the wind or the rustling of leaves. This was absolute silence, like the world itself was holding its breath. Then it turned. Its face was a nightmare, eyes sunken deep into its skull, black pits that seemed to swallow the light. Its mouth stretched wide, too wide, revealing jagged teeth stained with blood. It screamed, a shrill, bone-chilling cry that made my ears ring. And then it lunged ... My dad fired. I don't know if he missed or if the thing just didn't care, but it was on him in an instant. It tore into him, claws ripping through flesh like paper. I fired my .22, round after round, but it didn't bleed, not like it should have. I hit it with the butt of my rifle, screaming, but it didn't even notice me. It shredded him, tore off his skin, his throat, his face. I don't remember how, but somehow my dad's knife ended up buried in its shoulder, and I was running. I ran faster than I'd ever run, my dad's body slung over my back. I could hear it behind me screeching, crashing through the trees, snapping branches like twigs. I didn't look back. I stumbled into the gravel driveway of my landlord's house, collapsing near the campfire where he and his friends were drinking. I was screaming, crying, begging for help. And then he asked me something I'll never forget. "What's that on your back?" I froze. Slowly, I looked over my shoulder. There, tangled in the shredded remains of my dad's flannel shirt, was a pale, clawed hand. It's hard to explain the fear that grips you when you realize that something isn't just dangerous, it's wrong. Not a predator, not some wild animal, but something else entirely. Something that shouldn't exist. My dad wore that flannel shirt everywhere. It was his second skin. When I looked at what was left of him, most of his head, his torso, but nothing after the waist, I couldn't process it. I couldn't accept that the thing dragging him apart had already taken him from me. But then I heard it again. That screech, sharp, piercing, like a knife scraping against glass. It echoed across the dark fields, and my body froze. My dad's body, limp in my arms, was a reminder of what we were dealing with. He was gone before I ever picked him up, but I didn't believe it. I was still trying to save him when my landlord grabbed me, tearing me away and throwing me inside his house. The place was chaos. My landlord and his buddies were locking doors, barring windows, and loading guns while shouting questions at me. What happened? What is it? I didn't know how to answer. How do you explain something like that? That it wasn't just dangerous but wrong, its very existence defied reason. Somehow, they pieced enough together to know we were in deep trouble. Someone called the cops, who said they'd be there in 15 minutes. Then we saw it. It walked in front of the fire outside, its pale, twisted silhouette illuminated by the flames. "What is that?" one of the men muttered. "Looks like an ape," someone else whispered. Before anyone could respond, something slammed into the window. Glass shattered and we scrambled back, guns raised. But it wasn't the thing. It was my landlord's dog, or what was left of it, just the body. No head, no legs. Panic set in. Furniture was dragged in front of doors and windows, anything to keep it out. Then we heard the garage doors, the screech of metal twisting, the crash of glass breaking. "It's in the garage," someone yelled. We shoved the couch and the TV against the door leading to the garage, listening as it banged around. But then, it got quiet. Not like before, when the world had gone silent. This was worse. We could still hear it, faintly, moving, almost taunting us. They handed me a pistol. My hands trembled as I cocked the hammer back. That's when we heard it again. A window upstairs shattered, followed by that awful screech. "It's inside." We rushed to the staircase, barricading the door at the top. The thing hit the door, slamming it hard enough to rattle the frame. Its clawed hand shot through the wood, groping blindly. Someone with a shotgun aimed point blank and fired. The hand was severed clean off, dropping to the floor. But it didn't stop. If anything, it got angrier. The door cracked, splintering under the force. Someone shouted for us to get down, and then the top half of the door was blown away. My ears rang, the air thick with smoke and splinters. When I looked up, it was gone. The cops arrived just after sunrise. I was still glued to what was left of the door, unable to move. They took me to a hospital where people tried to get me to talk, but I couldn't. Not for a long time. Years later, just before I left for the army, my landlord invited me over for a drink. I asked him what the cops had told him. "A wild animal," he said. "A wolf, maybe a bear." "But what about the hand?" I asked. He looked at me, stunned. The hand had never made it back to the station. The cop transporting it crashed his car into a tree and died on impact. The hand was gone, vanished, and the official story was that it was just the paw of a bear. I never saw my landlord again. He went missing while I was in basic training, and they said he ran off owing money to the wrong people. But I don't believe that. Not after what happened to my father. He went back to those woods after my mom died. Said he didn't have anything left to lose. He never came back. Years later, I tracked down one of the FBI agents who had come to investigate. After plying him with drinks and cash, he admitted they got calls about those woods every year. People vanished, and the cases were quietly closed. Before he left, he scrawled something on a napkin, the Rake. I didn't know what it meant until I searched for it. I wish I hadn't.